30 meters beneath the frozen earth of eastern Ukraine, inside a labyrinth of Soviet-era concrete and steel, sat one of Russia's most closely guarded secrets, a network of underground missile bunkers, hidden, fortified, and until recently believed to be invincible. But on a cold morning in late 2023, Ukrainian intelligence did something extraordinary. They didn't just find these bunkers, they mapped every entrance, every ventilation shaft, every weak point, and then they blew them sky high. This is the story of one of the most daring intelligence and strike operations of the entire war. A story of espionage, cutting-edge technology, and a single devastating blow that changed the trajectory of the conflict. Launched from Russian and Belarusian territory, Kate-101 cruise missiles dropped from strategic bombers. The bombardment was relentless. Power stations, water treatment facilities, apartment buildings, hospitals. Nothing seemed off limits, but here's the thing. Not all of these missiles were coming from traditional launch sites. Ukrainian air defense analysts began noticing something strange. Launch signatures appearing in areas with no known air bases. No visible TELs, transporter erector launchers. No surface infrastructure at all. Missiles were being fired from what appeared to be empty forests, farmland, industrial zones that showed no signs of military activity. The Ukrainian military command was baffled. How do you launch a ballistic missile without any visible infrastructure? Where are they hiding the launchers? And more importantly, how do you stop them? It didn't make sense until someone remembered the archives, the old Soviet blueprints, the underground facilities. A retired Ukrainian engineer, a man who had actually worked on one of these bunkers in the 1980s, was brought in for consultation. He spread out yellowed construction documents on a conference table in Kiev and pointed to a map. "Here," he said, "and here, and here. These were the sites. I helped build 3 of them myself. Could Russia be using them? Could they have reactivated Cold War-era bunkers and turned them into hidden missile launch sites?" It seemed almost too obvious. But the more Ukrainian intelligence looked at the data, the launch patterns, the geographical locations, the timing, the more it made sense. The answer was yes. Russia had been using these underground fortresses all along, and it was about to become Ukraine's top intelligence priority. In the spring of 2023, Ukraine's main intelligence directorate, known as the GUR, assembled a specialized task force. Their mission was simple on paper but nearly impossible in execution. Find Russia's underground missile bunkers, all of them, and find them before the next barrage. The team was a mix of signals intelligence officers, satellite analysts, former Soviet engineers who had worked on these facilities decades ago, and field operatives willing to go behind enemy lines. They called the operation Podzemny Udar, underground strike. The name was chosen carefully. It was a promise, a declaration of intent. The operation would require every intelligence tool at Ukraine's disposal. Human sources inside occupied territory, signals intelligence to intercept Russian military communications, satellite imagery from commercial providers, historical records from dusty archives, and perhaps most importantly, people willing to risk their lives to get close enough to confirm what the technology suggested. The first breakthrough came from space. Commercial satellite companies, many of them American and European, had been providing Ukraine with near real-time imagery since the war began. Companies like Maxar, Planet Labs, and others had opened their data streams to Ukrainian intelligence. But the GUR wasn't just looking at visible light. They were analyzing thermal signatures, infrared anomalies, patterns that didn't match natural geology. One analyst, a woman named Olena, had been staring at thermal imagery of the Luhansk region for weeks. Most of her colleagues thought she was wasting her time. The area was heavily forested, sparsely populated, no major military installations visible from above. But Olena had a hunch. She noticed something peculiar, a series of heat blooms appearing in the middle of a forest. No buildings, no roads, just trees. But underneath, the thermal signature suggested massive ventilation systems pumping out heat from deep underground. At first, her supervisors were skeptical. It could be anything, they said. Natural geothermal activity, underground fires, even animal burrows can create thermal anomalies. But Olena persisted. She cross-referenced this with old Soviet construction records pulled from Ukrainian archives, and there it was. A facility built in 1983, officially classified as a strategic storage depot, unofficially. A hardened underground missile complex capable of housing and launching Iskander-M tactical ballistic missiles. The facility had been designed to store up to 20 missiles. It had independent power generation, water supplies for a crew of 50 personnel, and multiple launch tubes that could fire missiles directly from underground positions. On paper, it was the perfect hidden launch site, but thermal imaging alone wasn't enough. They needed confirmation. They needed eyes on the ground, and that meant sending people into one of the most dangerous places on Earth, Russian-occupied territory. 3 weeks later, a 6-person Ukrainian reconnaissance team infiltrated the area. The team was composed of GUR Special Operations soldiers, men and women who had been conducting reconnaissance missions behind enemy lines since the war began. They moved only at night. During the day, they hid in carefully prepared positions, using portable ground-penetrating radar units borrowed from Western partners. Sophisticated equipment, normally used for geological surveys but perfectly suited for detecting underground structures. What they found confirmed everything. 30 meters below the surface, a reinforced concrete structure the size of 2 football fields. Multiple tunnels branching off in different directions. At least 4 separate chambers, and most critically, active power lines running from a concealed substation 3 kilometers away. The power lines were the giveaway. You don't run that much electricity into the middle of a forest unless you're powering something significant underground. The team spent 4 nights mapping the facility. Using ground-penetrating radar, they created a 3-dimensional model of the underground complex. They identified 3 separate entrances, 2 vehicle-accessible tunnels and 1 personnel access shaft. They located the ventilation system, a series of disguised air shafts spread across a half-kilometer radius, and they photographed the concealed power lines and transformers that fed the facility. The team didn't engage. They observed. They mapped. They transmitted encrypted data packets back to GUR headquarters via satellite link, and then they disappeared back into the shadows, moving westward toward Ukrainian lines. The exfiltration took 3 days. They were nearly compromised twice by Russian patrols. But they made it back, and the intelligence they brought was pure gold. Over the next 4 months, this process repeated across 6 different locations: Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, Crimea. Each time, the pattern was the same. Thermal anomalies detected from space, cross-referenced with Soviet-era construction records. Ground reconnaissance to confirm, and slowly, painstakingly, Ukrainian intelligence built a comprehensive picture of Russia's underground missile network. By September 2023, Ukrainian intelligence had identified 8 operational underground missile facilities inside Russian-controlled territory. 8 fortresses that Moscow believed were invisible. 8 high-value targets that could cripple Russia's tactical missile capabilities, if neutralized. The intelligence was briefed to President Zelensky and his top military commanders. The question was no longer, can we find them? The question was, can we destroy them? But finding them was only half the battle. Destroying them? That required something entirely different. Something that would test the limits of Ukrainian military capability and Western weapons technology. The problem with underground bunkers is simple. They're designed to survive. These weren't some hastily dug trenches or shallow dugouts. These were military-grade fortifications designed to withstand nuclear near misses. Reinforced concrete up to 3 meters thick. Steel-reinforced blast doors weighing dozens of tons. Multiple redundant chambers so that even if one section was compromised, the others could continue operating. You can't just drop a conventional bomb and hope it penetrates. You need precision, you need power, and you need to know exactly where to hit. Ukraine didn't have bunker-buster bombs, not the American GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator, a 14-ton monster designed to penetrate 60 meters of earth and concrete. Not even enough British Storm Shadow missiles, which were being rationed carefully for the highest value targets. What they did have was ingenuity and a willingness to think asymmetrically. Ukrainian military planners studied the problem for weeks. They consulted with engineers, with demolitions experts, with Western advisors who had experience targeting hardened facilities in other conflicts. And they came to a conclusion. Attacking the bunkers directly, trying to punch through meters of concrete from above, was the wrong approach. The plan they devised was audacious. Instead of trying to destroy the bunkers themselves, they would strike at their vulnerabilities. Every underground facility, no matter how well designed, has weaknesses. Ventilation shafts that bring in fresh air and expel stale air. Without ventilation, the facility becomes uninhabitable within hours. Blast doors that, while incredibly strong, have mechanical components, hydraulics, motors, control systems, that can be damaged. Power lines that feed the entire system. Without power, the facility goes dark. Launch systems don't work. Communications fail. If you can cut off the air supply, flood the ventilation system with explosive force, or collapse the primary entrance while simultaneously hitting secondary exits. You don't need to destroy the entire bunker. You just need to make it operationally useless. Trap whoever's inside. Destroy the missiles before they can be moved. Create enough damage that repairs would take months or years. And send a message that nowhere is safe. The GUR coordinated with Ukraine's military intelligence, special operations forces, and long-range strike units. They selected their weapons carefully, based on what was available and what each target required. Storm Shadow cruise missiles provided by the UK would be used against the largest facilities. These missiles, with their broach warheads, could penetrate hardened structures and detonate inside. Neptune anti-ship missiles, repurposed for land attack, would strike ventilation complexes and power substations. And in some cases, teams of sappers, combat engineers, would infiltrate and plant charges directly. Each target was analyzed individually. What were its specific weaknesses? Where should the strikes focus? How many weapons would be needed? What was the probability of success? The planning was meticulous. Every detail mattered: timing, approach routes, backup plans if primary strikes failed. The operation was scheduled for late October 2023. The targets: 3 bunkers in occupied Luhansk, 2 in Donetsk, 1 in Zaporizhia, and 2 in Crimea. 8 simultaneous strikes across a 1,000-kilometer front, executed within a 4-hour window to prevent Russia from reacting and moving assets after the first strike. It would be the largest coordinated deep strike operation Ukraine had ever attempted, larger than the strikes on the Crimean Bridge, more complex than the attacks on Russian air bases. And if it worked, it would fundamentally change the missile threat equation. October 27, 2023, 0200 hours. Across multiple Ukrainian military installations, the final preparations were complete. Storm Shadow missiles had been loaded onto Su-24 fighter bombers. The weapons, each weighing over a ton, hung from reinforced pylons under the wings. Neptune missiles sat on their mobile launchers, pointed skyward, coordinates programmed into their guidance systems. Special operations teams were in position near 2 of the bunkers, ready to breach and demolish. In the GUR Operations Center in Kyiv, deep beneath the city in its own hardened bunker, a room full of intelligence officers and military commanders watched a bank of screens showing real-time feeds. Satellite imagery, drone surveillance, encrypted communications channels. Everyone knew what was at stake. If this failed, it would be catastrophic. At 0217 hours, the first aircraft lifted off, a pair of Su-24 fencers from a classified airbase in central Ukraine. They flew low, hugging the terrain, using valleys and riverbeds to mask their approach from Russian radar. Their payload, 2 Storm Shadow missiles each. Their target, the primary bunker in Luhansk. Storm Shadow is a remarkable weapon. Developed jointly by Britain and France, it's a long-range cruise missile with a range of over 250 kilometers. But more importantly, it has a broach warhead, Bomb Royal Ordnance Augmented Charge, a 2-stage penetrator designed specifically to bust through hardened targets. The first charge creates a path through concrete. The second detonates deep inside. The Su-24s reach their launch point at 0243 hours, 30 kilometers from the target. Still undetected. The pilots got tone. Lock confirmed. And released. 4 Storm Shadows dropped away from the pylons, their turbofan engines igniting. They descended to ultra-low altitude and accelerated toward the forest that concealed Russia's underground fortress. Meanwhile, 150 kilometers south, two Neptune missiles launched toward one of the Donetsk bunkers. These were targeted at the ventilation complex on the surface. The plan was simple: hit the ventilation system hard enough to collapse it into the tunnels below. And in Zaporizhzhia, a 12-person Ukrainian Special Forces team had spent the last 72 hours infiltrating through Russian lines. Their mission: reach bunker number 6 and destroy it from the inside. They carried 40 kilograms of C4 explosive, breaching charges, and thermal lances capable of cutting through steel blast doors. At 0251 hours, the first storm shadows arrived at the Luhansk target. The missile's terminal guidance systems activated. Infrared seekers locked onto the heat signature of the ventilation shafts. And in a fraction of a second, all 4 missiles impacted within a 20-meter radius. The first warhead punched through 2 meters of reinforced concrete. The second detonated inside the ventilation system. The explosion didn't just destroy the shafts, it created a catastrophic overpressure wave that blasted through the underground tunnels. Personnel inside were killed instantly. The missiles stored in the main chamber were engulfed in flame. Secondary explosions rippled through the facility as fuel and warheads cooked off. Within 90 seconds, the largest bunker in Russia's network was gone. At 0254, the Neptune missiles hit Donetsk. Both struck the ventilation complex. The explosions were smaller than Storm Shadow, but no less effective. The ventilation system collapsed. The power substation feeding the bunker was severed. And with no air circulation and no power, the facility became a tomb. By 0300 hours, 4 of the 8 bunkers had been struck. But the most dangerous part of the operation was still unfolding in Zaporizhzhia. The Special Forces team had successfully breached the secondary entrance. Using thermal lances, they cut through the outer blast door in 8 minutes, then moved inside. The interior was dimly lit, emergency lighting only, a sign that the bunker was in standby mode. They moved quickly, placing shaped charges on support columns, laying C4 directly against missile storage racks. One operator attached a charge to the main electrical panel. At 0311 hours, they set the timer, 30 minutes, and began their exfiltration. But then something went wrong. A Russian patrol arrived at the main entrance. 4 soldiers. They noticed the cut lock on the secondary door, raised the alarm. The Ukrainian team had 2 choices: engage and risk being pinned down, or run. They ran. Gunfire erupted in the forest. Tracers lit up the night. The Russian patrol called for reinforcements, but the Ukrainians had a head start, and they knew the terrain. They disappeared into the darkness, moving toward an extraction point 5 kilometers away where a helicopter was waiting. At 0341 hours, the charges detonated. Even from 5 kilometers away, the explosion was deafening. The ground shook. A plume of smoke and debris erupted from the hillside. The entire facility collapsed inward. Missiles, fuel, personnel, electronics. Everything buried under thousands of tons of rubble. The team made it to the helicopter, lifted off, and vanished into Ukrainian-controlled airspace. 2 members hadn't made it, cut down by Russian fire during the exfiltration. They were posthumously awarded the Hero of Ukraine medal. By 0600 hours, all 8 targets had been struck. 6 bunkers completely destroyed, 2 severely damaged and rendered inoperable. An estimated 40 Iskander-M missiles destroyed before they could be launched. Dozens of Russian personnel killed, and an intelligence asset that Moscow had relied on for decades, gone. But perhaps most importantly, Ukraine had sent a message. We know where you hide. We know how to reach you, and nowhere is beyond our reach. The immediate Russian reaction was chaos. Within hours, Moscow began frantically moving remaining missile assets to new locations. Hardened facilities that had been in use for months were abandoned overnight. Launch schedules were disrupted, and the psychological impact on Russian forces was profound. For nearly 2 years, Russia had operated with a sense of strategic impunity. That assumption was shattered in a single night. Western intelligence agencies took notice. The operation demonstrated Ukraine's ability to conduct complex, multi-domain strike operations deep behind enemy lines. It wasn't just about destroying bunkers. It was about intelligence fusion, combining satellite data, human intelligence, signals intercepts, and historical records into actionable targeting. The United States, Britain, and other NATO allies increased their intelligence sharing with Ukraine. Commercial satellite companies provided even more access, and critically, more advanced weapons began flowing into Ukrainian hands. The strategic impact on Russia's missile campaign was immediate and measurable. In the month before the bunker strikes, Russia was launching an average of 80 to 90 missiles per week at Ukrainian targets. In the month after, that number dropped to 45. Not because Russia ran out of missiles entirely, but because their launch infrastructure had been crippled. The surviving bunkers were too exposed to use. Mobile launchers became the primary method, but those were easier to track and more vulnerable to Ukrainian strikes. Russia's missile forces went from operating out of fortresses to playing a constant game of hide and seek. And in that game, Ukraine had the advantage. But there were costs. The Special Forces team that struck the Zaporizhzhia bunker lost 2 members in the exfiltration, and the intelligence network that made the operation possible remained in constant danger. Russia launched a massive counterintelligence operation. Suspected informants were arrested. Communication networks were purged. Security around remaining military installations was tripled. For months afterward, the GUR faced a significantly harder operating environment. Some sources went dark. Others were compromised. Yet despite the costs, the operation fundamentally altered the strategic balance. It proved that even Russia's most protected assets were vulnerable. It demonstrated Ukraine's growing capability to strike not just tactically, but operationally and strategically. And it forced Moscow to divert resources away from offensive operations and toward protecting what remained. In the broader context of the war, the destruction of the underground missile bunkers represented a turning point. For the first 18 months of the conflict, Ukraine had been largely defensive. But starting in late 2023, the dynamics shifted. Ukraine began taking the fight to Russia's rear areas, striking airfields, ammunition depots, command posts, and now, underground bunkers that were supposed to be invincible. This shift had cascading effects. Russian logistics became more complicated. Supply lines became longer and more vulnerable, and the psychological advantage that Russia had enjoyed evaporated. For Ukraine's civilian population, the impact was tangible. Fewer missile strikes meant fewer air raid sirens, fewer destroyed apartment buildings, fewer civilian casualties. The operation didn't end the missile threat, but it reduced the intensity. And in a war of attrition, every reduction matters. International perception shifted as well. The narrative of Ukraine as a victim, dependent entirely on Western aid, began to evolve. Here was a nation not just defending itself, but actively degrading the enemy's war machine through intelligence, innovation, and audacity. That narrative made it easier for Allied governments to justify continued support. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact was doctrinal. The operation became a case study in modern warfare. How a smaller military can leverage intelligence and precision to offset an adversary's quantitative advantages. How old Cold War infrastructure can be exploited as a vulnerability, and how the combination of human intelligence, satellite technology, and surgical strikes can achieve strategic effects. Military academies from West Point to Sandhurst began studying the operation. NATO updated its own doctrines on targeting hardened facilities, and adversaries around the world took note. The era of assuming that burying your assets underground makes them safe was over. Of course, the operation didn't win the war. The conflict continues. Russia still launches missiles. Ukraine still defends. But in the calculus of war, where every small advantage compounds over time, the destruction of those 8 underground bunkers mattered. It mattered to the families who didn't lose loved ones, because a missile was destroyed before it could be launched. It mattered to the soldiers on the front lines who knew their rear areas were safer. And it mattered to the international community, which saw proof that supporting Ukraine was strategically effective. In the end, the story of Ukraine's underground bunker operation is about more than missiles and explosions. It's about the power of knowledge, the courage to act on incomplete information, and the relentless determination of a nation that refused to accept that any enemy asset was untouchable. 30 meters beneath the earth, Russia thought it had built invincibility. But Ukraine proved that nothing is invincible. Not when intelligence meets opportunity, not when precision meets will, and certainly not when a nation fighting for its survival refuses to stop searching for the enemy's weaknesses, no matter how deep they're buried. The bunkers are gone, now collapsed, silent, entombed under rubble and soil, but their destruction echoes still. A reminder that in modern war there are no true sanctuaries, only targets that haven't been found yet, and a warning to any adversary who believes that depth and steel can protect them from the reach of those who fight, not just with weapons, but with knowledge, ingenuity, and an unbreakable will to win.